Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this because I read your article. I forget who told me about it. It may have been Dundina Bradley, who is now part of the formation of this California Institute for Stress and Resilience, and told me about the article. I read it, and I got so excited when I was reading it. I could literally feel it, not just mentally excited, but I was feeling myself bouncing up and down in my chair as I was reading it. And I just was dying to talk to you about just about it, especially with all your experience and the colleagues that you brought together to create a different way of thinking about dysregulated stress, chronic stress, and how it might be treated in with more evidence-based practices. So, a couple questions for you. One is, tell me about the stress phenotype framework. I feel like I read the article, I've got all the details, but I know like this much, just a little bit. And you're the expert, and I would really love to know, what is it? A stress phenotype framework.
I mean, we're all experts, and I really, really appreciate you having this space. And I'm so glad you read the article. Um, and I am super curious how it fits with Wisdom Works and bringing in all the great assessments, Be Well, Lead Well, Pulse. Um, the way we were thinking about the stress phenotyping framework is that stress biology is so complicated. And even just taking a step back from that, it's fascinating to me that experiences change our biology. Like we kind of intuit that, but we don't really think about what that means on a very day-to-day level. So how I perceive something, how I experience my world is actually going to change what neurons fire in my brain, what proteins and hormones are released into my bloodstream. It's going to actually change things like my heart rate speeding up, or if I'm hungry or full, or if I'm angry, or if I feel like fighting something. Like it's going to change all these molecular behavioral things. And we don't really capture that yet in a way. Like we intuit it and we know it, but we're not capturing it. And even when you think about the mental health world, it's very symptoms based, which can be really helpful for us to kind of put symptoms in, boxes and categories, but it doesn't tell us what's happening underneath.
Mm.
And so the stress phenotyping framework is really a mental model to think about how are all the domains that experiences are changing our neurobiology, our physiology. Could we create a model that then we could assess better, and have biomarkers and questionnaires, um, health technology that helps us really understand, okay, for me, for my kid, for my patient, for my client, what's happening for them? What is their stress physiology? And that then opens all these windows to more targeted precision medicine, personalized interventions. Because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of amazing interventions out there. How do I know what's going to work for me? How do I know what's going to work for my kid when they're struggling? Um, so a long version of saying the stress phenotyping framework. It provides 8 domains of ways that experiences affect our biology, our neurobiology, our physiology, and gives us a pathway to start identifying on both a clinical, personal, research level, what's going to work for me, what's going to work for the person in front of me to help them.
So I think part of why I got so excited when I read the article and when I looked at the model, because the model itself, as you said, it's a mental model, and I'm sure it'll continue to evolve as we learn more and all that. Um, what excited me so much was number one, how integrated it was, because as you mentioned, that we have so many disparate and fragmented
Mhm.
efforts and really good efforts, good work in the world that's happening to support our mental, emotional, physical health and well-being. But often it's so fragmented. So to see a perspective about chronic stress all together in one place. So that first off was excited me. But the second thing was the personalized that you mentioned, where we started to map out and I say you, I know as a whole group of colleagues. So I'm talking the collective you when I say you, started to map out this, okay, so how does this way of looking at a human system help us understand what is going to really support that system the best instead of trying to throw everything at it?
Right.
Because often I know in my own life and some periods of really significant stress that I've dealt with, because I didn't have this way of looking, I tried everything. I just
Yep.
tried everything, and I feel grateful that that worked. But boy, it could have been a shorter. It could have been a potentially a shorter healing journey,
Yeah.
for me
Yeah.
personally. So I really appreciate those two things. You mentioned 8 domains. I actually have the picture here, so I've got the 8 domains right in front of me. But I wonder if you could tell me a little bit, mainly for anyone else who's listening to this, if you could share those. And again, I can cue them. You may not have the picture right in front of you. So, yeah.
I know I mostly have them memorized, but I want to make sure I don't miss anything. But,
Oh,
I
hey, I'm
think
the same
I
way.
really thought of a bottom-up approach. So when we think about all of our experiences and through our nerves, are into our lower brain, and specifically through what we see, feel, hear, touch. So coming in through our senses, through our cranial nerves to our lower brain. So that's that sensory motor system. And that sensory motor system includes your pain processing. It includes, again, all those touch, feel, see. It includes your vestibular system, how balanced you feel, how grounded on the floor you feel. So right there and then, it's affecting that system. And so are there ways to capture the endogenous cannabinoids, the endogenous opioid system, that pain system, your vestibular system? Are there ways to assess and then help people with that domain? Then it's going to go up to that arousal and energy system. Like, where do I pay attention? Like, oh, something just happened. Oh, I need to look over there. I need to divert my energy and my attention there. So that's arousal and energy. And that includes things like sleep and your circadian rhythm, reward processing. So now I'm going to get rewarded for paying attention to that thing that may save my life. Do I go towards it or do I move away from it? Do I have to run away? So, and that's your dopamine system and can lead to things like addiction or, um, rewarding. It can reward healthy habits or unhealthy coping habits. You have your autonomic nervous system. So that's the one where it's going to raise your heart rate, raise your blood pressure, sympathetic nervous system, or parasympathetic. It's going to slow your heart rate. Um, going to depend on tell your blood vessels to constrict or not constrict, that kind of thing. Then you have that endocrine HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So endocrine, what hormones are getting released, cortisol, immune. We don't think about it, but our stress system is designed partly to protect us. So it's actually telling our whole immune system, get ready, just in case. So it's like a little military in our body to protect us. And so it's activating that system and saying, being ready. And it does that in an anticipation. We don't think about that too. So just thinking that there's a threat tells my immune system to get ready,
Mm.
even if there is no actual threat, or even if the threat goes away before anything happens. Cognitive processes, and I think that's an area where Wisdom Works in particular has done an amazing job. So I'd love to continue that conversation, but really how we interpret the thoughts that we tell ourselves, how our brain interprets what happened. Um, so, oh, the bear is friendly, and I love bears because my mom was an expert in bears and they're great, versus, oh my gosh, there's a bear right there. I'm freaked out, right? But how you perceive it, how your brain interprets it is really important. Um, and then attachment and relational. So how now all of those pieces fit together for you and I to relate with each other and align our systems. And how all of these other domains are affecting even our conversation today, how you perceive me, how other people watching this video are going to perceive me, that kind of thing.
Awesome. So that's literally, I can tell you went through all 8. You kind of went
Mhm.
all the way around the circle and almost did it in a, this happens and leads to this and leads to this. And there, so my sense is as you describe it, so tell me if I'm wrong here, that these are interdependent. I mean, they're interdependent systems.
Definitely.
And yet they also have distinctions, so
Mhm.
nuances from one pathway to the other. Um, that was super helpful, actually. I'm wondering then, so what does that mean then when you say, okay, this is a new way of seeing chronic stress? And I keep saying the word chronic stress or dysregulated stress because I don't want, one thought that I do think we have in the world that I'd love to shift is that stress is bad.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
stress is not bad. Stress is not
Mhm.
bad. And in fact, you know, from all the conversations we had last week, that I believe we need stress. We need stress to thrive. We need stress to feel alive. We need stress to grow and learn and um, and shift our capacities and capabilities as human beings. So that's how we grow and evolve. And yet we seem to be operating often in a state of chronic dysregulation. So this chronic stress, and that has such a cost
Mhm.
personally, and it has such a cost to our organizations, and it has such a cost to our societies. And right now we are living in a time where it seems catching, like contagious. It feels
Yeah.
like chronic
Yeah.
stress itself can feel very contagious.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, with this new way of seeing stress, chronic stress as a multifaceted, these multifaceted pathways and interdependent pathways, what does that mean then for diagnosing? Would you use the word diagnosing? Exploring, examining. Diagnosing feels like a really hard
Yeah.
word,
Tricky.
but
All
a
of these
tricky
things are so
word.
tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how would you describe then how would you would apply, maybe let's say that, apply the framework and what that would mean then for things that some a practical something one might do to
Mhm.
support then their chronic stress. So I'm really trying to stay away from the word diagnose. I can tell. I can
Right? Yeah.
tell.
Yes. Because there's so many nuggets that you said in there, and I have so many thoughts, and I wanna see if I can track all of them. Because one of the really key things that you talked about was that stress itself, our stress response is this fantastic evolutionary process that keeps us safe. It helps us survive, like, we need it. It's a beautiful process. And not only that, we pass it down from generation to generation to prepare our kids biologically, physiologically, for the world that they're gonna grow up in. And I always tell this story of this one stress paper, a research paper, because I just think it's so fascinating. They took male mice and they paired a scent with a shock, such that at some point these mice just freaked out, had a stress response to the scent itself.
Okay.
They artificially inseminated another mouse, female mouse, and that mouse had babies. Those babies never met their dad, never were shocked, but still had a stress response to that smell.
Wow. Wow.
They
Wow.
did it again. So the grandchildren never met their dad, never met their grandfather, never were shocked, but still had a stress response to that smell. So, like,
That's
I get goosebumps when I think about it. So it's
me
this
too.
beautiful, right, evolutionary process that helps us survive, helps us know threats and pass that down to our next generation. The Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, they talk about positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. Um, and positive stress, we need to practice that stress response, and we need it to help us get aroused and to focus our attention. So, if we have a big test coming up, we have a big presentation, it's what gives us the energy and the motivation, and we get the dopamine to tell us we're doing a good job, right? These are all really fantastic things. Where chronic stress and toxic stress, first off, there's all it kinda also goes back to your talking about how we're siloed, right? So there's all these amazing researchers out there in neuroscience, psychology, social work, medicine, biomarkers, health technology, right? And they're all using different words. So chronic stress, toxic stress, still to be determined if they're the exact same thing. But when you have so the stress response was designed to be quick, right? Like there's a predator, I mount my stress response, I survive, I don't get eaten by the lion, and now I move on, like the stress response is over. and I don't have to worry about it until the next time the lion appears, hopefully not for weeks, months. But in our current day, we have minute by minute stressors. Like, we're all worried about climate change. We're all worried about social unrest. We're seeing really scary videos, shootings, you name it. There's just a bombardment of we're never just idle anymore, like, unless you're pretty much taking a shower, like, even at the bus stop, right, you're on your phone, even at line in the DMV, you're, like, constantly bombarded with information, so what is it doing to us when this stress response is happening over and over and over again? So over and over again, your heart rate and blood pressure up. Over and over again, sugar is being pumped into your body to give you energy, but it's just sitting there, right? So you can start seeing, oh my gosh, that's going to lead to high blood pressure. Oh my gosh, that's going to lead to diabetes. Oh my gosh, that's going to lead to chronic anxiety or depression, depending on how your brain is perceiving all this chronic stress. So, on one level, it's a beautiful adaptive process to help us survive in our current world, but it's often at the expense of our long-term health. And kind of what I think one of the questions you're going to get to are long-term thriving, just feeling good, feeling happy, feeling content. Um, and so I'm not entirely sure I answered your question because you had so many good thoughts in that I was like, oh, I want to talk about all of them. So did I get to the actual
Well,
answer?
we didn't answer that question, but I've got that question still, so I'm going
Okay,
to ask it again. But before I do, you actually made me just think of something. I just posted something. It was a few days ago, and I think it was my way of saying something that you just said, and so I want to reinforce what you just said for the two of us and for anyone that is listening. And that is, how are we designing our lives, or unconsciously or unconsciously? Like sometimes it's just our lives are happening and we're showing up to our lives, and of course that's maybe true for all of us, in such a way that it is shaping our biology, that it is actually shaping our biology. So I think the jury's out on how the notifications that we have on all these apps that are constantly bing, 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 bing. And I understand they were designed that way to get you to look at them. They were designed to give you a dopamine hit so that you would actually look and then keep you engaged. I get that. But I'm now wondering the long-term consequences of doing that now for years, which we've now been in this collective global experiment for years with our, what,
right,
95% rate, of people having smartphones. So we're in this huge experiment. What is that doing to reinforce a reactive orientation? So in a lot of leadership development work, we actually talk about, how do you lead from a more creative and generative orientation, from a place of thriving, rather than a reactive orientation? And yet we have devices and their computers and all that are actually constantly reinforcing the physiology of reactiveness.
Mhm.
So you just made me think of that again, and how and even in my own life, I need to get way more aware and more diligent, because
Right,
some of these appliances, these tools that we are using that really serve us in fantastic ways, like couldn't live without them anymore, you know?
right,
And yet, I will speak for myself. Sometimes I've been less conscious about how I'm using them. And I'm noticing myself now wanting, like, I'm turning all the notifications off. I'm just turning them all off.
yeah,
Unless it's someone
yeah,
on my parents who may need me, or my husband, or it's someone on my, you know, absolutely important they can get through list. No more, no more, because I
right,
can't
right,
think. It's hard to
right,
think clearly when
right,
all this is constantly bombarding you. And that's just one element. We also have media and, all of what everyone's talking about. But it's interesting to me to connect that with your work, and how
mhm,
that your original statement at the very beginning of this about how our experience shapes our biology, you know,
right,
how we think and how we act is actually shaping what's going on. So my question for you was, how is this being applied, this stress phenotyping framework, And I know it's new, so the application may also be pretty new to apply it as a framework. But how is it being applied, and how can that framework, that different way of thinking about chronic stress, how can that help us think through what strategies we might use to support our coping, our stress management, and beyond stress management, our thriving? So
Right.
because I know you're as committed as I am to people thriving, not
Yeah,
just managing stress, but to
exactly.
thriving. Yeah.
Exactly. So, really great question. And there's sort of three ways right now that this is being used. One is we do have a research grant at Stanford through the California Initiative to Advance Precision Medicine. And there we are actually, so we have a questionnaire, for example, a survey that asks questions from each of these domains. Um, and then we're doing biomarkers from each of these domains. We bring people in and we actually give them a stress challenge. So we're getting the biomarkers and the surveys before and after the stress challenge. We are measuring electrical activity through EEGs.
Hmm.
And so while they're getting stress challenge. And then we're going to follow them over the year. And they're going to employ a lot of the strategies that are in wisdom work. So the framework that we're using is something called stress busters. But essentially it's the same as lifestyle medicine. It's a lot of again, the things that you have in wisdom work. So really thinking about mindfulness and physical activity and nutrition and getting a good night's sleep and relationships. So a lot of the same things. So they're going to do that over a year, and we'll bring them back and we'll do the same thing. So then we can actually, from a research perspective, start seeing, which questions, which domains line up with their stress response and what interventions helped with each of the domains. So that's one area.
Nice.
I do have a small clinic in San Francisco where we are doing a stress well clinic. And so that's where actually I'm seeing patients and I again have a whole assessment and I'm really trying to map out for them what's going on underneath and how that might direct intervention. So for example, I have a patient who her stress, she was bullied, at a young age, and that's manifesting as chronic pain. And so really getting hunkering down more on that sensory motor and pain regulation. And so things like low dose naltrexone, for example, has helped her. But really thinking, okay, so it's this global stress that's dysregulated, but what for you? Um, and then another kiddo who is having panic attacks after she fell backwards, so had a pretty significant fall, had to go to the emergency room, and so since that time has had breathing issues associated, with panic. And so for her, we really thought about, okay, this is a bottom up respiratory breathing impact. And for her, it felt more about autonomic nervous system and regulating that. And so she was referred to brain spotting. So, really thinking, and at the end of the day, a lot of this is we're going to see.
Sure.
So, and that's where I think you might have mentioned, but we want to start the California Institute for Stress and Resiliency nonprofit research center where we can really test this model and also, as you said, iterate, right, and innovate and say this is just a starting point. So maybe there's more domains. Maybe we can collapse some of the domains. Maybe we need to expand it. Maybe we need to figure out the nodes. So using AI, using technology, using everybody's brilliant brains, we can come together and keep moving the work forward.
I think every model, every really good model, helps, like, illuminates something. It helps you do something or helps you see something that you didn't see before. And every good model is up for being evolved,
Hmm.
because that's the point of the model. It's not the territory, it's a model. And
Yeah.
it can't point to everything. So I love that you're, through the California Institute and these other experiments, that you are, and practices, the work that you're doing with your clients, um, you're gathering feedback and some insights to be able to figure out, is there a different way of even conceiving this model at some point, or different practices that we might add to it, or how else, what might we use it? That is really terrific. So my next question really links back to, last week you were in the certification program and we
Yeah.
were talking about thriving and the different psychometrics of thriving and factors of that. And without going through all those different factors, I'm really curious because we've been talking a lot about more chronic stress, and you've mentioned examples of different some traumas that people have had that really have lingered for a long period of time, whether it's the fall that you mentioned that someone had, or I mean, I can think of traumas of um, you know, being put down as a female or racism, or there's just so many traumas that we have in childhood that really stick with us as
Yeah.
adults.
Yeah.
So how does all of this for you link to this idea of thriving in the middle of our demands?
Great, really great question. And again, my brain is going in so many different
Go
directions.
for it. You just go all different directions.
I think it's interesting, both the healthcare system broadly, mental health and physical health, we do have a very fix it mentality and a very sort of chronic illness mentality and a mentality that health is just the absence of disease.
Mhm,
So if you have diabetes, you're going to have diabetes forever. We're just going to manage it. Or if you have pneumonia, we're going to fix it and you'll get back to baseline, right? But it's not. And then even things like anxiety and depression, they it feels like they're talked about as if that's just you forever.
mhm,
Can we? It feels to me like we can do more. Like it doesn't have to be just the absence of anxiety. First off, I don't think they're chronic illnesses. We could treat diabetes. There's a lot of emerging literature that you could really help somebody with that lifestyle medicine and reverse diabetes.
mhm,
But we don't think about it that way. So, changing that mentality that these chronic illnesses maybe don't have to be chronic illnesses. Anxiety doesn't have to be a chronic condition. So that's one thought for me. And then the
mhm.
second is, okay, so now we, treat them, well, but what's beyond that? So it's not just the absence of anxiety, it's how do I live this? And this is what you guys are doing. So I actually kind of want to ask the question to you.
Oh, no, no, no. I'm interviewing you
So,
right now.
right? So it's like, how can we be content and be, in collaboration and be aligned with the people, with our values, our mission, our purpose, and constantly, and we're not going to feel that way. We're not going to feel that way every day, right? It's the long game. So I mean, I'm going to feel anxious. I'm going to feel depressed. I'm going to feel sad. And overall, like if you add them all up, I'm going to have way more days that I just feel really aligned, connected, living my values. I'm happy, right? All the great things that you guys talked about in Wisdom Works. So yeah, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, well, I was joking with you that I wasn't going to answer, but I actually will give you some
No, I
thought,
want you to.
and you could put me on the spot just like I put you on the spot, because some of what you said would be, I think I'm so aligned with what you're saying about one of the big shifts that I feel like we need to make, we collectively, we in business, we as leaders in business, we as people in society, we as neighbors of each other, we as the way that we see ourselves, is the idea that humans are not something to be fixed. Humans are not broken. We're not
Right.
something to be fixed. So you kind of mentioned that same idea, and that one is at the heart to me of all of this work. Because if I am coming at my own life, my own traumas, my own challenges, my own um, um, mistakes or failures, but as I need to be fixed, what I think has to heal is the relationship I have with myself.
Mhm.
This deeper relationship, really seeing ourselves as marvelous, incredible, complex, multifaceted, sometimes not understandable. Like sometimes we're kind of mysterious about how everything works. Pretty awesome. And we have physiological systems. The body is always wanting to work for us. Like I really believe it's always wanting to work for a place of um, kind of balance. And we often are living and designing our work and lives in a way that continually reinforces a message of getting off track and being dysregulated as our norm. So this idea that we're not something to be fixed, if we can even hold ourselves and each other in that way, that changes everything that happens after. It's such a pivotal shift in consciousness, I think, in how we see ourselves and others. So that's a biggie. The other one that really hits me is just a big shift is that we are designed that to be already be resourced to meet our demands, that we have internal resources that we can bring forward and prioritize
Yeah.
that are natural. When you look at a baby,
Mhm.
it already has a sense of curiosity. A baby already has a sense of awe and wonder, a bit and the ability to learn. And
Mhm.
these are incredible capacities that we have to move into the world and evolve and grow and thrive. And yet we lose track of that. We lose track of that. We start to identify ourselves in boxes and or others identify us into certain boxes and certain identities, and we get stuck there and we believe it and we get
Yeah.
stuck there.
Yeah.
So we forget that we already have the capacity to learn, to grow, to thrive. And so it kind of get back to, for me, that is a huge thought. I think of healthcare. Well, I think of actually a huge trauma that I had and that I told you about last week was, being held up at gunpoint and being told that I was going to be killed and all of that without going into that detail for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
My startle reflex was so quick and I would scream really quickly and I understood why all this was
Mhm.
happening. And for about at least 2 of those 3 years, my skin, everything on me itched. So my
Mm.
skin would itch from head to toe
Yeah.
24/7, but no rash, no sign of anything. It was just almost like an invisible barrier. Don't touch me is what, if I had a metaphor, that's what my skin would have been saying. But I just knew it was happening. Wasn't sleeping anymore, I felt perpetually jet lagged. So, I mean, it was a horrible, horrible time. And I would need to urinate about 60 to 70 times a day,
Mhm.
which is, of course, it's a stress response.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I was diagnosed with interstitial cystitis. And I remember the diagnosis. Luckily, someone came into my life, and I can't even remember exactly who it was, but they were a psychologist and also a coach, and I wasn't even using them that way. They were just in my life. They kind of came in and out of my life and said, and I was sharing this, and they said, Renee, all I can say to you is do not crystallize your thinking around that diagnosis. Do
Yeah.
not. And it, for some reason, it hit me as, wow, I need to pay attention to this. And so I didn't, decided never to believe it because I was told you will always have this. You'll have to take this drug. You'll have to eat a certain way. You will deal with this the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, no, I won't. And I think this is because I just had a major traumatic experience that my
Mhm.
body is processing. And so I started doing all these biofeedback training and just all these different activities on my own. This is what I was telling you. It ended up
Yeah.
being a very fragmented approach, but
Right.
I had a core purpose. I am healing. I'm going to have to take charge of my healing because there is nobody to talk to
Right.
about this. And then all of a sudden I didn't need the drug and I wasn't, then my body was working normally and my skin wasn't itchy all the time. And it was just this gradual process and it took a long time and a real discipline of I am committed to myself. I am really committing to my own healing.
Mhm.
So your framework is very personal to me because I
Yeah.
see it as, wow, if some of the practitioners I would have in the healthcare system, and not just healthcare, if I think of doctors and nurses more in the hospital setting, but
Mm.
mental health professionals, which I was also working with, if they would have understood this framework, who knows, would there have been a different idea about what I was going through and a different direction, guidance they could have provided, which I ended up needing to do for myself. So this is, and everyone who's listening to this has their own story of this,
Right.
of, how are we choosing to identify with our chronic stress, and then it becomes us. So when I think of like your question to me about what's the relationship between thriving and this chronic stress, it's how can we learn from it? How can we grow through our stressors? That's
Yeah.
another part of another consciousness shift I would hope for our healthcare system is supporting, is not buying the story that you are your disease,
Mm-hmm.
not buying that story, and helping people see that you were always more than that. You were always more than that. It does not mean always that the disease is going to heal. Maybe it won't. Maybe I would have continued to have interstitial cystitis. Maybe so. I don't know. Luckily, I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have to become the disease. You can actually learn, mine it for insights, mine that experience, and really grow and thrive, like build your capacities to thrive, even while dealing with that. So that's a frame of reference that I also don't really see in our healthcare practices.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's
Thank
my
you so much for
very,
sharing that story. And it's a beautiful, amazing story, and it completely um demonstrates there are so many of us out there that are struggling, and the healthcare system does not know this. And there are so many shining examples like you that took your health into your own hands, had the you know, part of just the privilege, right? And but also the brilliance and the foresight to go, to go seek out all these other additional treatment modalities and interventions. Like your story is amazing and it's so inspirational. And even when I think of like the stress phenotyping framework, for example, like you were talking about being itchy.
mhm,
So, if you have, so if anybody's taken morphine, right, in the hospital, if you have too much morphine, it'll make you itchy.
mhm,
And there is a way in which, when our stress response system is dysregulated, part of the stress response system is actually to release our own endogenous opioids.
mm,
I'd be really curious if that itchiness was again part of your stress response, releasing your own internal endogenous opioids. And that the goal, probably like from a physiologic level, was to help you feel numb, right? To help you not have to feel so much pain, or to protect you in case there was pain, that you wouldn't have to feel it so much.
mm,
By producing all of that opioids, it was probably making you really itchy. And so all the work that you did to regulate your stress system, to tell your lower brain, we're safe now. That was then. Now it's not happening today. We're safe. Your system could then stop releasing so much. That would be my guess. Like we I don't know.
fascinating.
We'd have to like measure it, and that's what we want to look at. But all the things that you're talking about, I mean, and I think too, it's beautiful that that person, kind of gave you that nudge, because I do think there's so many people out there, right, that have a lot of these chronic conditions that haven't been able to make that connection. That actually a lot of these systems are a dysregulated stress response system.
Mhm,
Yeah, I had one kiddo who had been treated for anxiety for 3 to 4 years, and it was getting worse. Her depression and anxiety were getting worse, and was getting traditional cognitive behavioral therapy. And when I went through both her symptoms and like her history, she actually had clear signs of PTSD. Like she actually fit every single criteria. And so when I had it, I actually, just the conversation I had with her was like, actually, you have a really adaptive, beautiful stress response system that's working for you. Like, there's kind of, to your point, you're not broken. There's
mm,
nothing to quote fix. It's just helping your brain feel safe again. Like, because you had a series of traumatic events, and it makes total sense that your body is doing all these things. It's just trying to protect you. And just that conversation, she was able to kind of go, oh, like this, I'm not just like this broken, sad, anxious person. I'm not going to be this way for the rest of my life. It's just my system trying to protect me. And oh, now I can just do, and she's thriving. Like going back to your thriving, like 'cause she was brilliant. She was brilliant, and she was trying to put all the pieces together in her head, like why do I feel this way? Why am I like she was 10 and could beautifully talk about how I feel like there's two different people
Mhm.
inside. There's this one person who like just feels like it's all hopeless. I just am this way and I don't know why and I can't fix it. So like going down this downhill path. And there's this other part of me that like is super hopeful and passionate and wants to heal the world. And she was on the school newspaper and she was like an advocate for like so it was just integrating those two parts of her to be like, no, no,
Yeah,
your system's beautiful.
but that you helping her have hold a different frame of reference and to even interpret what was going on in a different way
Mhm,
opened up a new possibility. Like it opens up a new possibility for who she is, what path she can take, how she can think about this, how she can respond, how the story she'll tell about it, the narrative that she'll tell about it.
mhm,
I think all of these elements are so critical in
yeah.
our full healing. And I want to go back just really quickly to something you just said about having the privilege, which I totally agree with. I'm super aware that I had the privilege in my story or my experience to not only had I been in the human development, leadership development, wellness field for a long time, so I knew, okay, there are more things that I can do here that I'm hearing in the healthcare system. So I already knew that. So great. So just professionally and just from a curiosity standpoint, I was interested in that. But secondly, that I had the privilege to go seek those things.
Mhm,
And so, can you say anything about your experience of, I think, the privilege itself and
mhm,
how that plays into what access we have or don't have? I know so many activities that can really support our stress levels. Number
mhm,
one, we all have access to, and that is how we frame our situation and how we our relationship with stress. So we all have access to how
yeah.
we frame that in our relationship with stress. And then there's so many activities that are available to all of us, although people might not think about them. So the ability to breathe and
Mhm,
okay, to take a conscious breath. I mean, this is a practice. You take a breath when you come into the world, you take a breath when you leave the world, and it's available to you in every single moment. And yet still there's so many people that don't realize this is a practice that they can use. So there's many practices that are available to everyone, but people don't know about it. But then there's lots that's just not available. And so I'd love for you to say a little bit about that, the element of privilege, if you just if you have any thoughts about that.
yeah. Well, and you're making me think. So part of the reason I also really appreciate thinking about stress and stress biology, because it helps me think that there's two parts of that equation. And you kind of mentioned it too. There's the stressors, what's happening in our environment, and how much control do we have over that? So sometimes we don't have control and kind of coming to terms with that, whatever that means for us. But sometimes we do have a lot more control than we think. You know, and that there is an element of privilege in that, right? Like, could I quit my job? Could I realistically quit my job? Could I realistically say no to that opportunity? Well, if I don't have money, if I don't have resources, so there's ways in which privilege shows up right there. And what are those environmental stressors? You talked about it: discrimination and racism and poverty. Um, so these are, and we don't always have control over them. So there's privilege right there. And then on this internal stress response side, you know, right now, a lot of these interventions are not covered by insurance.
Mm,
So if you want to get brain spotting, if you want to go to an integrative medicine physician, if you want to buy some of these supplements, that's out of pocket right now. And so there's a way in which um, part of it is just even your circle, your spheres, to know that those are options. But then even if you know they're options, can you afford them?
mm,
Um, so that's another way, privilege shows up for all of us. And what do we have access to? So this comes up a lot. I totally hear what you're saying. Like on one level, nature, being out in nature. I mean, being out in nature on one level, you're like, well, that's free. We could all go out in nature. And I was just though talking to somebody. I had gone up to Reading for this really amazing conference, and she was saying, yeah, but where I live, I would not feel safe going out in nature. Like if you go to the park, that's where people get mugged. That's where the scary things happen. And I would not let my kids go out to the park. So it's it's like there is a lot of privilege in safe spaces in nature. So, I am super lucky. I live in San Francisco. I'm not that far from the beach. So if I have a really bad day and I'm just like, oof, I need some support. I can for free-ish, right? Drive down to the beach and just sit. But that's not always true for everybody. So how do we there's a social justice aspect to
Mhm.
this work, right? How do we help people with their stressors, lighten their stressor burden, be the advocates, and increase accessibility to safe stress mitigation strategies and make these things affordable, make them available? How do we push that work forward? So,
Yeah, well, thank you for your thoughts on that. I know we weren't expecting to talk about everything we talked about, and I loved the conversation. And I just appreciate going back to this article, which we'll make sure that people get, and the research you did, you and your colleagues have done. It's really wonderful work. It is really wonderful work. I just want to say, as a colleague to you, how helpful that I think it's going to be to anyone who is interested in mental, emotional, physical, social well-being and really supporting people in a whole new way. So I really appreciate your work and what you're up to.
yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation and to sharing your story. And there's so much more to talk about. I'm just so
There
excited to
is.
continue this conversation, and be, nerdy advocate pioneers together in this space.
Yeah, thank you.